I'm going to bring in Christine Townsend, who's a local councillor in Bristol, who I believe has been involved in a campaign to get the statue down or move it away or just get it off there for some time, but nothing happened. As we saw in that video earlier, one of the defendants was saying he had signed lots of petitions and nothing had happened. Christine, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah. The first thing, the first thing I want to say is that as part of countering Colston, we were never targeting the statue. It just wasn't ever part of our, that was something that kind of became questions that we were asked as the reality of what was happening in current education and religious practices began to be more understood in Bristol. People started to ask us, well, what about the statue? And we were kind of like, no, we're more interested actually in the current practices within some of our state schools and within our cathedral. So if I start with that,
right.
I'm a teacher by profession. And in 2003, I moved back home to teach and work. And it was number 9 in terms of the academies in the country under the Labour government, as was. And it was run by a merchant venturer. Now, I'm a Bristolian. I'd never heard of the merchant venturers. But as the years went by, I kind of began to understand and learn a lot more about who these people were and what this organisation was. And then they brought 2 of their private schools into the academy system, Colston Girls' School and Bristol Cathedral School. And I was very interested in how they were going to allocate those school places. And that's where I came in. So I was going after their practices in terms of their state education long before I got involved in anything to do with Colston. Huh. So moving on to 2013, a local journalist got into a cathedral ceremony right down in the centre of Bristol, and he was able to take the sermon that the then Bishop of Bristol, a bloke called Mike Hill, was giving to state children attending state-funded schools. So by this time, they were running 5 state schools. There were hundreds of children in the cathedral. And the Bishop of Bristol told these children that it was speculation about how Edward Colston made his money. And that got into the press because he was an investigative journalist. And that was kind of what sparked my interest in what they were doing around Edward Colston, because I'd known since I was a kid that he was a slave trader. I played netball for my school in Bristol, and we would call Colston Girls' School, we're playing the slaver school. We knew Ed Colston was a slaver, right? It was well known. So the following year in 2014, we went down to the cathedral and we kind of started to encourage with some leaflets for the children and some of the staff to start questioning some, the content of these rituals. So, for example, the children would wear like a bronze, his favourite flower when they went to these ceremonies. At the end of the ceremonies, they'd give the kids something called a Colston bun. So and they would read extracts of the man's will in their rituals. And these, bishops sit in the House of Lords. And this man was comparing Edward Colston in the same sentences as Jesus Christ. So that's what we started to do in 2014, was the current religious and educational practices that were going on for our state children in our school. And it kind of began to occur to me why it was that the myths about Edward Colston were able to be so propagated and fixed in the minds of Bristolians, because the merchant venturers had run private schools. And we know where people that go to private schools can largely end up in terms of the tops of the pyramids of power, whether that's within the legal systems or whether it's within the political systems or whichever kind of systems those are. And when you're encouraging children from a very young age to have a particular view of a particular person or a particular event in time, it becomes very difficult for them at later dates on an individual level to kind of change their mindsets around that. And we see that, you know, that's quite evident when people are taught things at a young age, that becomes part of their own identity. Well, I mean, you know, this will come out a bit more. I think that the society and the cathedral and various people that would defend this cult began to attack us on personal levels. They began to attack us on a kind of organizational level. But we were quite lucky in the sense that we had a couple of really supportive local journalists who kind of saw it for what it was, and therefore they were able to listen to the kind of the historic research that was then being done by the historians we were working with, and they would be then they began to report this. But the pushback was enormous. I mean, you know, we saw that sort of locally, but we're also seeing it now at a national level. And there's the level of ignorance that was perpetuated through these myths will take, I think, you know, a long time to get rid of across the country. So, you know, I mean, we're quite, you know, we're middle-aged to older people, I suppose, and we weren't really that bothered by these attacks that they were giving us. But had we been younger and less experienced, or or a bit more naive in what we were trying to do, it could have been very easy for them to shut us down, because this is the power of the state. There's this merchant venture institution, but it's also the, you know, the Church of England and the council. So that was, you know, these are quite powerful institutions to try and take on and to try and change that sort of tidal wave of what it is that they're trying to propagate in terms of the stories around Edward Colston. And during this period, the Colston Hall was celebrating its 150 years in existence. And in 2011, they'd announced that they would look at a name change at that time. So it just so happened that the time was right. So we then had a couple of demonstrations outside the Colston Hall to kind of remind them really of what they'd suggested that they would be doing in 2011. And really, that was one of the first dominoes that was to fall. And there was huge pushback against that as well. People were kind of going, you can't change the name. If you change that name, what other names are you going to change? And, you know, my comparison with that is half the schools in this city have changed their names because they became academies, and nobody batted an eyelid. The Society of Merchant Venturers took over a state school in South Bristol that was called Withywood Community School, and not only did they not have a consultation about changing the name, they changed the name of this school and they named it after themselves, and it's called the Merchants Academy. Nobody cared. No, they didn't care as an institution what anybody who went to that school in South Bristol thought about the fact that they would be changing their name. And yet what we see literally just before the trial started is the private Colston school making a huge, you know, being in the paper and having a massive year-long consultation about whether they should even change the name, let alone what that new name should be. So it's this kind of different approach to their state schools. That doesn't matter. The people that went there, you know, whatever cultural and memories they have about their school time isn't important. But when it comes to this private school that's got this apparent massive legacy, then that's really important. We've got to listen to what these people think. And it's very class orientated and it's very wealth based. So yeah, I mean, that, and you know, the rest is history, as they say, I suppose. But my own personal interest was about current educational and religious practices.
Wow. So it's a far bigger story than the statues. I mean, I
oh god, yeah. I mean, I could go on for hours, but I won't, obviously, Crispin, because it's. But
how
yeah.
do you? I mean, we haven't got very much time, but how do you feel about the statue verdict? Has it given you hope that the other things will change as well, or do you think they're just going to say that that's been resolved and therefore that's it?
No, I think that this will, in the same way that the statue toppling kind of reverberated, I think that this jury verdict will reverberate. I mean, we've seen the backlash from the right. We've seen the backlash from the Tory MPs that are kind of having kittens over the fact that the jury service, the jury system came back with a not guilty verdict. Had they come back with a guilty verdict, that everybody would be going, excellent, fine, let's move on. But the fact that they haven't now, it's kind of, let's attack another aspect of our democracy. And it's really important that we kind of defend our jury system, and that's what it's for. It's about 12 peers looking at the evidence and deciding whether in this specific case these 4 people were guilty of a criminal act of damage, as opposed to the damage that they completely accepted that they were involved in. And the thing that's not really being discussed, I don't think, is this kind of concept of proportionality. Because if all you got to do is watch the video of what happened, and you can see it's kind of, why is there only 4 people that are in court? Where are the other hundreds of people that were involved in putting it down, putting graffiti all over it, rolling it all the way down, hundreds of meters down to the end of the watershed, and then eventually putting it into the water? So I think that that it's a fantastic victory for democracy. It's a fantastic victory for the jury kind of concept, whereby those 12 members were able to actually listen to the defence and the rationale behind why and how it is that it was that statue in this city on that day in the global context of a pandemic that went in the harbour.
So thank you very much for coming on, Christine. That was amazing to hear all that history. Really appreciate you spending the time to come on.